Okay, so as we continue with our pandemic version of organizational behavior and design, we're going to tackle chapter 14, which is some more information about leadership, and it's going to focus on styles and behaviors specifically. We mentioned earlier that leadership is different than management. A manager is someone who is making sure that the work is getting done, that people are showing up on time, that they're checking up and making sure that all of the assignments are being completed on time and that they have enough resources to make sure that their employees are in a position to succeed. Leadership implies that people are willing to follow you. So some managers are good managers and they are not particularly good leaders. Some people have great leadership capability, even if they're not in a management position. Some people happen to have it all and they can be both a good manager and a good leader. And you probably have known managers who have had the title of being a manager, but they are not particularly well-versed or skilled at getting people to agree to do what they want or inspire them to do work outside of what they've been assigned to do. Leadership is often a requirement of organizations that are looking for transformational leadership, somebody that's able to really change the way things are going. If you don't have somebody that can inspire the will to work hard and to buy into what they're trying to get you to do, chances are the organization is not going to go down that path. Leadership is defined as the use of power and influence to direct the activities of people that are working for you in order to go towards a common goal for achievement. So if the organization is a manufacturer and they're trying to make a certain amount of products at a certain level of quality, then a leader would be able to use their power. Some of it is obtained formally through their title or their status within the company because they have been named a manager or a CEO or a vice president. Some of them have power because of their skill sets that we talked about previously, like expertise and influence as well. Whether or not you are able to get people to buy into what you want them to do kind of depends a lot on whether you can convince them that it's the right thing and that they trust you to follow you. Slide 4 is looking at the leadership member exchange theory. So they talk about a dyad. A dyad is simply a situation that involves two players. So the leader is going to talk to a member of a group and be able to either influence or affect their performance based on their skills. If a member is talking to someone within his group or an in-group, then in order for that member to really function at a high level and buy into the idea that the leader knows what they're doing, there has to be mutual trust, there has to be respect, and there has to be an obligation that is felt. Sometimes you may want to work hard for a boss, not because the boss is the boss, but because you like the boss, because you agree with the boss, because the boss has relied on some personal capabilities to ask you to do something and you don't want to let them down. So when you're in an in-group, when it's somebody that you're dealing with on a regular basis, you definitely are going to have a relationship geared towards mutual trust, respect, and obligation. When you have an out-group, this is usually not something that's going to be based on mutual trust and respect because you're not necessarily going to have a high level of personal contact with these people. They may be from another department within the organization, and they may feel an obligation to do something, but it's not exactly like in your so-called in-group. It may be that people are considered in a out-group, even if they're within the same sphere of influence for the leader. So I could be working in your department or a manager's department or a leader's department, and I don't necessarily have a lot of communication with that person. Therefore, even if I'm in the same group on paper, I'm not in the so-called in-group. I'm not with the cool kids. So therefore, I may not have the same response. Even if you're working with people from outside your organization, if you can communicate with them, you can get them to buy in. When you're working with your own employees, they may consider themselves part of an out-group because they're not the ones that you're communicating with. Ideally, a leader should be inclusive and try to get as many people in the in-group as possible because you want to make sure that everybody's going to be working cohesively together. Slide 5 is another one of these surveys that they use to determine whether or not the leader exchange quality is at a high level. And this is really related to relationships and communication. So the first question is, do you have a close working relationship with the supervisor? If you strongly disagree, it's a 1. If you strongly agree, it's a 5. There are 7 questions, so the high score would be 35. Midway would be somewhere around 17 or 18. It looks like the average score in the survey here is about 24. So most people who would respond to this do think that there's a reasonably good level of leader-member exchange. The next question is that you have confidence in the actions and the intentions of the supervisor. I think the bold one here is one of those ones that you have to reverse the score for. I would use my power to help my supervisor. My supervisor and I both understand likes and dislikes. If you read all those questions, the only way that you can answer affirmatively in any of those is if you have a good relationship and you communicate at a high level with the party that you're trying to evaluate. If you've got somebody that doesn't share a lot of information with you, you're probably going to score low. So in order to have that exchange between the leader and the member, that they interact well, there's going to have to be communication there. Slide 6 is basically a breakdown of how the various types of personality issues has to relate to the emergence and effectiveness of a leader. Leader emergence is related to the concept of someone actually rising to the standards to be able to be viewed as a leader. Again, you may claim that you're a leader, but people don't pay attention to you and they don't really follow what you say. You're not going to have a lot of legitimate power in that respect. So if you are someone with high conscientiousness, that is someone who pays attention and follows the job through, that is definitely linked to emergence. It is not necessarily linked to effectiveness. It may be a better indication of effectiveness for a lower level employee rather than somebody who's trying to get you to follow them. So conscientiousness, finishing the job at hand, that's not as important for effectiveness in a leader. Hopefully the people that are following him have a high level of conscientiousness so they can follow through on the tasks. Low agreeableness means that you're not likely to buy into what a lot of other people are saying. That is also surprisingly linked to emergence. However, it still has very little correlation to higher effectiveness as a leader. Low neuroticism is not linked to emergence or effectiveness, but the rest of these that are listed here are high in both categories. So high openness to experience, high extroversion, high cognitive ability, high energy level, ability to tolerate stress, and having self-confidence. They are all related to both emerging as a leader and being an effective leader once you're in that position. It should be noted that this way of viewing leadership and the personality or traits behind them, it's not a particularly strong argument because the correlation between each one of these is relatively low. So in order to get a better sense of what types of things should be considered when you're viewing a leadership style, you want to look at the next slide, which is really going to be looking at how a person behaves in the role of a leader. Slide 8 shows the different types. We've got the delegative, facilitative style, consultative style, and autocratic style. On the left, you've got the high level of follower control, and then at the other side, you've got the high level of leader control. So if you're an autocrat, that means you're kind of like a dictator. To be autocratic means that you're making all of the decisions, you're not getting a lot of input from your staff. One thing I want to point out is none of these are necessarily better than the other. I think we've talked a lot about empowering your employees and involving them in the decisions that are being made. That doesn't necessarily mean that the autocratic style is bad, or at least it's not bad in certain circumstances. When you have the type of task that you're trying to achieve, sometimes the autocratic style makes the most sense. But when you look at this chart, the autocratic style basically means the leader is the one making all of the decisions with very little input. Consultative style means that they will at least ask their employees for input about what we should do. Facilitative style means that not only are we asking, we are kind of working with them to develop a consensus to determine what the decision should be. And the delegative style is when I actually delegate the decision-making authority to someone else. So as I said, the question is which one is likely to be the best? It's kind of a trick question. The answer is it depends. What factors might impact the appropriateness of the various styles? If you think about autocratic styles, I typically think of the military. I used to work for the Department of Defense. There is definitely an autocratic style that is prevalent there. But if you think about the nature of the military, when you go into battle, the general wants to say, go attack that hill. Do you want the general to say, hey guys, what do you think we should do? Let's take a vote. Under fire in a stressful situation, it may not be a particularly good circumstance for you to not have an autocratic style. You may want to involve some of those styles beforehand so that you can get enough information so that when you have to act in an autocratic style because time is of the essence, then maybe you are at least well informed. I also typically bring up the idea of styles in terms of the coach of the Patriots, Bill Belichick. If you ever follow football, and even if you don't, you probably know who he is, because if you live in Boston, kind of hard to get away from it. Belichick is viewed as an autocratic leader. He doesn't really give the impression that he spends a lot of time considering what other people's input are. He has a lot of authority within the organization. He knows who he can hire, who he can fire, and he basically makes decisions based on what he thinks is best. Interestingly enough, before Bill Belichick was the coach of the Patriots, a previous coach named Pete Carroll was the coach of the Patriots, and he was viewed much more as a player's coach, where he would be patting people on the back, talking to them, getting input from them, maybe not necessarily delegating his decisions, but or even facilitating. I mean, it is football. You have a head coach who tells you what to do, but maybe he was much more of a consultative style. A lot of people think that you need to be the autocratic Bill Belichick style, but once the Patriots moved on from Pete Carroll, he went to Seattle, and he won a Super Bowl and returned to a Super Bowl as well. So you can have success even in the same field with different types of styles. It may depend on what type of players you have, what types of business you're in, what your personal style is. If I am an autocrat and it comes natural to me, I will probably hire staff that responds well to it. If I move into an organization that has people that do not respond well to it, and that is my style, I may have some difficulty fitting in and getting people to buy into my decisions when they aren't used to that type of format. You have to be careful, though, if you definitely feel like you are more familiar with one style. If you're a bad fit for a company, if you're an autocrat and they're not, they prefer a facilitative or a delegative style, you have to be careful about trying to make your personality change to fit that situation, because it may come across as being counterfeit or not sincere. If you find yourself in that situation, you may want to make sure that you are a good fit for the organization before you actually take that job. Slide 9, I'm not going to go through because it's a little bit complicated, but they give you kind of a path that you can follow to determine which types of leadership might be the best on a given situation. The decision significance is how important is something to achieving either a project or an objective of the company. Not all decisions are life and death. There could be, what color should our letterhead be? I don't think that's going to necessarily be high in terms of significance, so you go to the bottom of that first column. The next one is the importance of commitment. How important is it that your staff buy into it? What kind of leadership expertise, how important leadership expertise is? The likelihood of commitment, that people will believe what the leader is trying to sell them. Whether or not there are shared objectives, the employee expertise, and teamwork that is necessary. Depending on how you answer for each one of those, you may end up at a different solution at the end, where you should either go to an autocratic, delegative, consultative, or facilitative type of decision-making or leadership. Slide 10 refers to the time-driven model, which is what we were just talking about on the previous slide. This is a little bit more detailed. There is scientific support for this, whereas there was a relatively weak correlation a couple of slides back when we were talking about leadership styles or in terms of characteristics for emergence and effectiveness. In this study, 68% of the time, the time-driven model showed that there are effective decisions being made. If you don't follow the model from the previous slide, effective decisions are only made 22% of the time. So there's a little bit more backing to show that the time-driven model has some success. Leaders' instincts usually violate the model. If you remember back to the beginning of the year when we talked about critical thinking, we talked about maybe a gut feeling isn't exactly the way to go, because sometimes common sense isn't really based on fact, it's based on bias and assumptions. So sometimes if you're using instinct rather than following through a process that's been vetted as being effective, you may not come out with the best decisions. So sometimes leaders like to be nice, they like to empower their staff, they overuse consultative styles, and they underutilize autocratic and facilitative styles for whatever reason. Sometimes they don't want to be viewed as the bad guy, but sometimes you need to make decisions without a lot of input from others because the necessity of the situation calls for it. Slide 11 is just a preview to the types of behaviors that leaders exhibit. Sometimes people who are not even considered leaders, at least in title, they act like leaders because they involve others, they inspire people to follow them. What types of behaviors, though, really contribute to that type of a perception? Move to slide 12. There are basically two ways that we look into it. The initiating structure, which is defining and structuring the roles of employees so that they can achieve the objectives that you set forth for them. And then consideration, which is the job relationships that people build over time that is based on trust and respect. And a leader showing that they are careful to acknowledge someone's feelings. Now, not to contradict what I said before, we were talking about decision-making styles with autocratic styles. You can be an autocrat in your decision-making and still have mutual trust and respect and consideration and involve your employees in conversations. It just means that the ultimate decision is yours. Being an autocrat doesn't mean you just get to be a jerk. We were simply talking about the nature of the decision-making that was being implemented. Slide 13 has another one of these surveys. I'm not going to go through all of it, but again, you can kind of see what types of things are considered when you're looking at structure and consideration. So never, seldom, occasionally, often, and always. I let the group members know what is expected of them. I encourage the use of uniform procedures. You go through this and find out how well people perform. So in the first 10 questions, the high score would be 50. 38 is still pretty good out of that. Out of the bottom 20, it's a little bit better. When you're talking about being friendly and approachable, these are the consideration issues at the bottom. I do little things to make it pleasant to be a member of the group. As you noted before, number 16 there is in bold, so you've reversed the score because it's an opposite type of question. So not keeping to yourself is viewed as a good way to be a leader for consideration to make sure that people see you as a person that they want to work with. Slide 14, we're looking at day-to-day behaviors, and that culminates in slide 15 when they talk about the life cycle theory of leadership. So the life cycle theory of leadership is also sometimes known as the situational model of leadership. It really argues for an optimal combination of both the initiating structure, which deals with how a leader defines the structures and roles that people have to comply with in order to get things done, things like planning and mapping out structure, and the combination with consideration, which is more of the personal interaction. It kind of depends on whether or not each employee and each work unit are ready for prime time, if they're ready to do the work. So readiness is going to refer more to whether or not an employee can do the tasks that they've been charged with, and whether they can be successful in pulling that out in an effective and efficient manner. So the categories that you're looking at the bottom row are delegating, participating, selling, and telling. So for R4, which is the high level of readiness, you can see it firing on all cylinders. Everybody knows what they're doing. You move down to delegating. Delegating simply means that you're able to give the responsibility over to the people that can do it and let them make their decisions, let them guide themselves, because if they're really ready to do the work, the manager or the leader in this case doesn't really have to do a whole lot of extra work. The initiating structure, the planning and legwork involved to get ready is relatively low in delegating, and even consideration is low because the people already know how to do what they need to do. You go to R3, which is a little less ready in terms of how capable the employees are. They're working well together, they're kind of getting over the hump, but they're not quite at a high level yet. That's going to be participating is something that you want to focus on, and that has a low initiating structure because you've probably already done it. If these are people that are progressing and evolving over time, you would have already created the initiating structure, but now you're focusing more on consideration. You're trying to get people to buy into it. The selling, which falls under R2, has both high initiating and high consideration aspects involved. And then, of course, low, it's going to be also both high initiating structure and high in consideration. What this is really telling you, the bottom line here is that a leader has to be able to look at their staff and figure out where they are. You could step into a situation where they're really ready at the red, the R4, and then you don't have to worry about a whole lot unless you are actually initiating something that's different from what they're used to because you want to customize it to your own leadership style. But if it's something where you've moved in and you're starting right from scratch, this could also be the evolution of how you behave with your staff as they move from low readiness to high readiness. You've already done the initiating structure and the telling and selling part. And then when they start to get into it, you just have to engage with the consideration and the respect and the feedback and all that stuff that the leaders would do until they can actually get to the part where you don't have to spend a whole lot of time worrying about the initiating structure and the consideration because you've already achieved your objectives and the staff is able to function at a high level. This doesn't mean that you don't need to continue to lead them. We're simply talking about the regular behavior that needs to be repeated on a regular basis. Slide 16 just asks you to review some effective leaders that you can name. They don't have to be politicians. It could be people you went to school with. It could be people in your friend group. It could be people at school, work, wherever. What types of things do you think make them effective? And can you apply any of the things that we've been talking about to some of those things that make them effective? 17, I referenced a little bit earlier. We talked about transformational leadership. So this is where you really need to get people to buy in at a high level so that they commit to instituting changes that take place to really modify the way an organization runs. Transformational leadership can also apply not when you're undergoing an overhaul of the organization. It can simply mean that you're transforming the way people behave to get them to comply with what the culture of the organization demands so that they could be successful. Transformational leadership is not focusing on the day-to-day transactions. So you can contrast that with the second bullet, which is transactional leadership. This is a little bit, as you can see, it refers to it as laissez-faire leadership, which is really not taking action. You're just letting things play out as they may. But I'm not really relying on any other strategy in my leadership toolbox to get you to go there. Transformational leadership, I'm trying to get people to behave in a particular way so that you don't even necessarily have to rely as much on transactional leadership. Slide 18 views both the laissez-faire transactional and transformational leadership. So the most passive and ineffective way is laissez-faire. You move in as a leader and you say, you have a job to do it or else. If you do it, you'll get paid. If you don't, you'll get fired. Not a huge amount of leadership potential is going to be exhausted there. A lot of people aren't going to be dreaming of how wonderful their boss is and telling everybody what a great place to work it is. When you're looking at passive management by exception, if laissez-faire is totally hands-off, they're not really doing anything. Management by exception is that you only step in when things arise. So rather than you not getting paid because you didn't do work, I actually take more punitive actions when something goes wrong, or I call out people that are doing a good job. I'm not really explaining why or how, I'm just doing it. So you're focusing on the work that is either really good or really bad in taking action. Otherwise, it's passive because you're not doing a whole lot of other things. Active management by exception on a transactional basis, meaning it's still kind of based on a quid pro quo. You're getting people to do something because of, a carrot on a stick, money for a reward. This is more, because it's active, it's something that you do on a regular basis. You're evaluating your employees, you're making sure that they're doing what they need to do, you're providing them with feedback. And then the contingent reward is when you create, say, a bonus program, and you say, if you qualify and you meet these criteria, then you're going to get this at the end of it. That's still transactional. The best out of all of the categories, most of them are transactional. Transformational leadership is the best in terms of the effectiveness and efficiency of the employees. Transformational leader, the people who work for you would be inspired by what you do. They don't necessarily have to be bribed by punishment or a bonus. It also creates a situation where people can perform at a high level because they want to rather than they feel coerced to do something. It's a little bit more pure in that sense, and it makes it probably a nicer place to work as well. That can lead to the other things that we talked about regarding commitment and satisfaction, which do have a slight correlation with better performance, but definitely have a high level of correlation for commitment and staying with the organization. Slide 19 is just a quad chart covering what we just talked about. In the bottom left-hand corner, you have the least effective passive way of doing things. That's laissez-faire. And then as you move up and become more active and more effective, you move through the passive, active, and contingent reward up to transformational. Transformational is what everybody should be striving for. So on slide 20, they talk about idealized influence, inspirational motivation, intellectual stimulation, and individualized consideration. So how could a leader behave in order to get these results? What idealized influence is essentially a leader walking the walk and talking the talk. They're being fair, they're treating people well, they're behaving in a way that they're exhorting other people to behave so that people can look at them and say, they're legitimate. What they're saying isn't something that they wouldn't be doing themselves. Inspirational motivation is the ability to get people to understand how important what they do is to the organization. So it's a little bit of the idealized, but you have to add the direction of what we need you to do. Me not just walking the walk and talking the talk, but explaining to you why the things that we're doing are important so that you can draw the connection between the work that you're trying to do, because it's important for the work to get done in order for us to be successful and make a profit. So that would inspire people to do the behaviors that we're looking for. Intellectual stimulation, a leader can challenge the people that are working with them. They can give them assignments that are challenging. You can get them to think about things. You can talk to them about it. You can have a give and take with them, and you can work with them to try and talk through some very difficult issues. You may also make your employees come up with a new way of doing things. If something isn't working and you're not going to be an autocrat about it, you could ask your employees, how do you come up with something better? Do some research, go out and find out a better way to do something. In other words, learn. So by doing that, you stimulate them intellectually and they'd be more willing to follow you in a leadership position. Individualized consideration is the interpersonal relationship that leaders have with their staff. You can do things like being a mentor, coaching, maybe having more personal time with individuals on the staff so that they understand what is needed. You're going to have to talk to the group together, but this is really giving an opportunity to maybe provide some individual attention to people who need it a little bit more than others. Slide 21 has the Transformational Leadership Survey. Again, are you someone who's going to be transformational? Out of a scale of about 30, the average score is only about 18. So not a lot of people really get that outcome where they are at the highest level of what you want to be. They may fall into more of that transaction middle ground. But inspiring others, being a role model, encourage other people to come at things for new angles, act in a way that builds trustworthiness. If you go back to the previous slide, that's the idealized, inspirational, intellectual, and individualized consideration kind of coming through here. So if you're able to do all those things, you'll be more likely to be considered a transformational leader, and hopefully your employees would be working a little bit better. Slide 22, we're going to look at whether or not this really matters. So transformational leadership is moderately correlated with job performance, but it is definitely correlated to organizational commitment. And in both cases, whether it's job performance or commitment, it does result in a higher level of outcome for both. That's it for Chapter 15. I'm going to try to get some more information ready for you, and I'll release it as we go through Moodle. Thank you.